The leather of my wallet felt paper-thin between my fingers, worn down by years of constant handling. I sat at the kitchen table, the bank statements spread out before me like a verdict. I traced the numbers with a trembling finger, searching for a mistake that I knew wasn't there. $500. Gone again. It vanished into the investment account on the first of every month, a ritual that had become a slow-motion hemorrhage. I looked at the balance, then back at the empty wallet. My rent was due in 3 days, and the numbers on the screen offered no comfort. They were just cold, digital ink. I had spent 5 years feeding this machine, sacrificing every small pleasure, every spontaneous night out. I had lived on the edge of my means, watching my peers move forward while I stayed anchored to this singular, relentless commitment. The silence in the room was heavy. Was this the foundation I had been promised? Or was I just burying my resources in a hole? 60 months. I counted them again, ticking them off in my head like a prison sentence. 5 years of discipline, of clicking that transfer button on the first of every month without fail. It was a mechanical, hollow act. $30,000 had flowed out of my reach, sucked into that digital abyss. I stared at the total on the screen. $33,600. A measly $3,600 in gain. That was the harvest, after half a decade of restraint. I leaned back, the chair creaking under the sudden shift of my weight. The math was a slap in the face. It barely covered the interest on my student loans, let alone the life I had imagined. The account felt less like an investment and more like a black hole, pulling in my labor and emitting nothing but silence. The urge to hit withdraw surged. I hovered my hand over the mouse, the screen glowing against the dark room, waiting for a sign. I looked down at my feet. The soles of my shoes were worn to the point of flapping against the pavement with every step, a rhythmic reminder of my self-imposed poverty. I had spent the last 5 years walking that line, while everyone else I knew seemed to be sprinting ahead. My friends had moved on to new cars, the kind that gleamed under the streetlights, signaling a life of momentum I couldn't touch. They posted photos from exotic vacations, landscapes of blue water and white sand that felt like they belonged to a different planet. Meanwhile, I sat at my small table, chewing on a homemade sandwich, the bread dry and the filling meager. It was a cycle of deliberate deprivation. I tracked every penny, skipping the weekend trips and the spontaneous dinners that defined their social lives. I watched them upgrade their apartments, moving into spaces with high ceilings and city views, while I stayed put, counting the cost of every utility bill. The envy wasn't just about the objects, it was about the freedom to choose. They were building memories, and I was building a spreadsheet. I felt the sharp sting of that divide. I stared at the final number on the statement. $33,600. I blinked, expecting the screen to refresh and reveal a hidden decimal or a missing digit. It did not. 5 years of steady, relentless contributions had yielded a total gain of only $3,600. The math sat there, cold and unyielding. I pulled up my student loan portal in another tab, the numbers glowing side by side. The interest accrued on my debt over the same period was nearly identical to the growth of my investment account. I had essentially been running in place, pouring my capital into a machine that barely kept me level with my own liabilities. The effort of 60 months, the missed opportunities, the constant monitoring of every cent it had all evaporated into this stagnant, mediocre sum. I leaned back, the screen light casting long shadows across the room. My hands felt cold. The promise of compounding interest, that grand engine of wealth I had read about, felt like a hollow fairy tale. I had sacrificed the present for a future that looked exactly like the life I was currently living. The reality of the gain was not just disappointing. It was a physical blow to my resolve, rendering the last 5 years of my life a quiet, calculated exercise in futility. A sharp, jagged laugh broke the silence of the room. It was a dry, ugly sound that caught in my throat, echoing off the bare walls. I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floorboards, and paced the small perimeter of my living space. I looked at the screen again, but the numbers did not change. They remained a testament to my own gullibility. I had been a fool, plain and simple. I had treated the future like a distant, holy destination, sacrificing every immediate joy, every small comfort, for a pile of digital digits. I felt the heat rise in my chest, a mixture of anger and self-directed mockery. I had played the role of the disciplined martyr. I stopped at the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. My reflection in the glass looked tired, drawn, and undeniably foolish. The promise of compounding interest had been a carrot on a stick, and I had spent 5 years chasing it with blind, desperate intensity. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, staring at the city, realizing that the person I had been was a stranger to common sense. I turned away from the window and walked back to the desk. The laptop screen glowed, a constant reminder of the money locked away in that digital vault. The urge to hit the withdraw button pulsed in my fingertips. I imagined the weight of a heavy, steel-cased watch on my wrist, something solid that didn't require an internet connection to verify its worth. I thought about the price of a flight to a coast I had only seen in magazines, the feeling of sand under my boots, instead of the worn carpet of this apartment. I could buy a ticket tonight. I could walk into a store tomorrow and trade those abstract numbers for something I could actually hold, touch, and use. The temptation was a physical itch. It gnawed at the back of my mind, demanding I stop the cycle of deprivation. Why keep feeding a black hole when I could have a tangible reward right now? I hovered my cursor over the account settings. The screen reflected my face, tight-lipped and restless. Every fiber of my being pushed me to cash out, to reclaim the 5 years of missed experiences, and to finally treat myself to the life I had been putting off for a future that felt like a lie. My finger hovered over the trackpad. One click. That was all it would take to end the charade. I imagined the screen refreshing, the balance dropping to 0, and the sudden, hollow relief of having that cash in my hand. But then, a quiet, stubborn voice cut through the noise of my frustration. It was the same voice that had pushed me to open the account 5 years ago. It whispered, "Just one more year. See what happens." I froze. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic, mocking pulse against the white background. I pulled my hand back as if the keyboard were burning. I stared at the wall, breathing in the stale air of the apartment, and let the silence settle. The urge to quit didn't vanish, but it lost its sharp edge. I reached out, clicked the browser closed, and opened my calendar. I navigated to the 1st of the next month and set a recurring alert for the transfer. My hands were steady now. I pushed the chair back, stood up, and walked toward the kitchen. The decision was made. I would give it 12 more months. The calendar alert arrived on the 1st of the month, just as it always did. I did not hesitate. I did not look at the balance. I simply logged in, entered the amount, and clicked confirm. The money vanished from my checking account with a soft, digital ping. It was the start of the 6th year. By the 7th, the process had lost its sting. The monthly transfer was no longer a decision I had to wrestle with. It was a reflex. I stopped calculating what that $500 could buy in the present. I stopped measuring my life against the visible spending of my peers. The act of saving became as automatic as turning off the lights when leaving a room. I would wake up, check my email, and perform the transfer. Before even finishing my first cup of coffee, the friction was gone. The internal debate that had once kept me awake at night had been replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm. I was building a machine, 1 month at a time, and I was no longer the one driving it. The machine was driving me. I moved through my days, working and living, while that small, consistent portion of my labor quietly slipped away into the void. It was a habit now, a silent, invisible thread weaving through the fabric of my existence. Life began to move at a different pace. Promotions came, bringing more responsibility and longer hours, while unexpected setbacks, a broken radiator, a sudden medical bill demanded my immediate attention. I navigated these waves, keeping my head above water, but the temptation to check the account balance remained a constant, dull ache. I knew that looking would only highlight the slow, agonizing crawl of the numbers. To protect my resolve, I took the phone and deleted the banking application. I replaced it with a simple, manual spreadsheet that tracked nothing but the date of the next transfer. I stopped looking at the total. I stopped calculating the interest. I focused entirely on the work in front of me, the emails that needed answering, and the projects that required my focus. If I did not see the number, the disappointment could not reach me. I lived in the present, dealing with the immediate demands of my career and the unexpected friction of daily existence. The account became a ghost, a silent entity that existed only on the first of the month. The rent hike hit in the middle of the 8th year. It was a sharp, sudden increase that threatened to derail the monthly transfer. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the lease renewal, and realized the math no longer worked. I had two choices: cut the investment or cut my living space. I chose the latter. I spent the next 3 weeks scouring listings for something smaller, something that would cost less and keep the momentum alive. I found a studio 3 blocks over. It was cramped. The floorboards groaned under every step, and the windows faced a brick wall. I signed the lease, packed my belongings into cardboard boxes, and spent a weekend hauling them up 3 flights of narrow stairs. The new place felt sparse, almost empty, but it felt right. Every time I paid the lower rent, I felt the difference immediately redirected into the investment account. I traded square footage for digits on a screen. I traded the status of a larger apartment for the quiet, compounding power of that digital foundation. My friends asked why I moved to such a small space, but I just smiled and said I preferred the simplicity. I was not living in a smaller room. I was building a larger future. My peers were moving at a different velocity. I watched them climb the corporate ladder, their social media feeds crowded, with images of new vehicles, weekend getaways to coastal resorts, and dinners at restaurants where the menus lacked prices. They spoke of bonuses and promotions with a casual ease that made my own steady, invisible contributions feel microscopic. One evening, a colleague leaned across the table, tapping his new watch against the wood. He talked about the luxury of the purchase, the weight of the metal on his wrist, and the status it signaled to the room. I looked at my own wrist, bare and functional, and felt the familiar tug of doubt. It would be so easy to stop, to redirect the monthly $500 into something that announced my success to the world. But I looked away, finished my water, and steered the conversation toward the project. I chose the silence of the digital account over the noise of their validation. I was playing a different game. It was a Tuesday, the kind of morning that usually blurred into the rest of the week. I sat at the kitchen counter, the steam from my coffee rising in a thin gray ribbon toward the ceiling. Outside, the city was already moving, a low hum of traffic and distant sirens filtering through the glass. I checked my phone, clearing out junk mail and work alerts, my thumb moving with the practiced rhythm of a decade. Then, a notification banner pushed down from the top of the screen. It was from the investment platform. I froze. Usually, these updates arrived on a set schedule, a predictable ping that I barely registered. This was different. My pulse quickened, a sharp, rhythmic thud against my ribs. I set the coffee mug down, the ceramic clinking. I stared at the icon, a small, blue square. My finger hovered over the glass. I took a breath, held it, and tapped the screen. The screen did not reveal the number immediately. A white circle spun in the center of the browser, a digital hourglass mocking my impatience. I watched the pixels rotate, my eyes straining against the glare of the morning light. My heart rate climbed, a steady, insistent drumming in my ears that drowned out the distant city traffic. I shifted my weight, the chair creaking beneath me, but I did not look away. Every second of that loading screen felt like a physical weight, a compression of 10 years into a single, agonizing heartbeat. I wondered if the server was down, or if the data was simply too heavy to pull from the cloud. I wiped my palm against my leg, the fabric rough and familiar, and reached out to tap the refresh icon. The loading animation stuttered, paused, and then vanished. The white space began to fill with text. Lines of code and account summaries flickered into existence. My breath hitched. The interface stabilized. The total balance finally materialized in bold black font. I sat back, my fingers gripping the edge of the laptop. The numbers snapped into focus. $75,700. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the digits again and again, waiting for them to shift or dissolve into a mistake. $75,700. The coffee I had been holding moments ago sat forgotten on the counter, a thin trail of steam curling into the air, ignored. My throat felt dry. I leaned closer, the glow of the display reflecting in my pupils, illuminating the stark reality of the total. It was not a rounding error. It was not a projection. It was the hard, digital truth of 10 years of discipline. I blinked, but the number remained, immovable and absolute. My hands, which had been gripping the edge of the table, slowly relaxed, though my grip on the reality of the situation tightened. The silence in the kitchen deepened, no longer heavy with anxiety, but thick with the sudden, overwhelming weight of the result. I simply sat there, anchored to the chair, watching the cursor blink beside the sum. It was a physical proof of a decade of quiet, persistent labor. I pulled up the records from the 5-year mark, my fingers trembling slightly as I navigated the interface. Back then, I had $30,000 invested, with a gain of only $3,600. It had felt like a crawl. I looked back at the screen. Now, the growth alone exceeded $15,000. The math hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was not just adding up. It was compounding. The initial sluggish pace had vanished, replaced by a momentum that felt entirely different. It was no longer a crawl. It was a walk, then a jog, and now it was picking up speed with every passing month. I traced the growth curve on the screen, watching how the line tilted upward, steeper than it had ever been. The consistency of those $500 transfers had created a machine that worked while I slept. I sat back, the realization settling into my chest, heavy and certain. The decade of waiting had finally paid its dividend. I looked at the balance and saw something beyond the digits. It was a decade of small, invisible choices. Every time I had declined a weekend trip or moved into a smaller space, I had been laying a brick. I had not seen the wall rising, but here it was, a massive, undeniable structure. The consistency of those $500 transfers had been an act of faith, a quiet rhythm that had hummed in the background. It was not a sudden windfall or a stroke of luck. It was the cumulative weight of 10 years of discipline. I thought back to the days when I felt like a fool, eating cheap meals and watching my peers spend freely. Those moments of restraint were the foundation. They were the engine that had built this reality. The uncertainty that had plagued me for a decade evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of a foundation finally set in stone. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking in time with my pulse. My mind drifted back to that day 5 years ago, when I had sat in the dark, staring at a measly $33,000, wondering if the effort was worth the cost. I had asked myself if $500 was enough to matter. I had been so wrong. The question was never about the amount. It was never about the market, or the timing, or the luck of the draw. The real question, the only one that mattered, was whether I had the grit to stay consistent, long enough for the math to take over. I had doubted the process because I could not see the end. I had measured my life in months, while the account was measuring in years. Now, the answer was staring back at me in bold black digits. It was not the intensity of the effort that built this, but the refusal to stop. I had been looking for a shortcut, a sign, or a miracle, when all I needed was the discipline to keep showing up. The doubt that had nearly derailed me 5 years ago felt small now, a ghost of a person who did not understand the power of time. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the same wallet I had carried for a decade. The leather was worn, thin at the edges, and still felt light in my palm. For years, that lightness had signaled a lack, a constant reminder of what I did not have. I ran my thumb over the frayed stitching, remembering the anxiety that used to surge whenever I checked the balance. But as I sat there, the weight of that old fear simply failed to return. I looked at the screen again, then back at the empty space in my hand. The wallet was still just a piece of leather, but the future it represented had undergone a total transformation. It felt heavy now, not with the burden of debt, but with the gravity of genuine, immense possibility. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. Below, the city grid stretched out, a vast network of lights flickering in the dark. Each point of light was a life, a project, a commitment. For years, I had viewed the city as a place where I was merely surviving, a spectator to the success of others. Now, the perspective shifted. I saw the city not as a series of obstacles, but as a reflection of the same principle that had built my account. Everything of value took time to construct. The sacrifice I had made, the missed trips, the smaller apartment, the careful tracking of every dollar was no longer a weight I carried. It had become the engine of my new life. I watched the traffic flow, steady and rhythmic. My future was no longer a vague hope. It was a tangible, growing force. I stood there, watching the lights, knowing that the foundation was set.